Perspectives and Relations with Europeans and the Effects of These Interactions is Professor Jon Parmenter from Cornell University, who also has a new book out. And it's coming out. Well, close enough. The book is entitled The Edge of the Woods, Iroquois, 1534 to 1701, Michigan State University Press. Name of the book coming then?
Early 2010. Great distinctions.
The title of my talk, Separate Vessels, Iroquois, Engagements with the Dutch of New Netherland, uses the word engagements deliberately. I like that word because what it does is give us a sense of Native agency in the context, the texture, and the events that occurred during the contact period. One engagement that we haven't talked that much about today happened about 100 years ago to the day today in Manhattan. Native people occupied a curious position in the Tricentennial Hudson Fulton Celebration Parade in Manhattan. Categorized as neither old families of New York nor members of the leading patriotic and hereditary societies, nor one of the multiple nationalities composing the cosmopolitan population of the state, Native Americans were defined as other nations and placed behind the members of various ethnic societies, including Irish and Africans, I would add, in the order of procession, marking, it would seem, their ineligibility for hyphenated American status. That said, it is clear that the organizers of the parade paid some attention to how they wanted to see Native people represented. The official report of the Hudson Fulton Tricentennial Commission reads that the Aboriginal possessors of New York State were represented in the parade by 70 real Iroquois Indians, men, women, and children, who were secured by the commission, for the commission by Mr. F.E. Moore, and who took the characters on the floats representing the Indian period. These Indians, dressed in their picturesque native costumes and still speaking the language of their ancestors, were the objects of intense interest, alike to the American spectators and to the official representatives of foreign nations at the parade's court of honor, before whom they executed a ceremonial dance. The parade floats, intended to provide, by moving tableau, memorable scenes in the history of the city and state for public education and entertainment, included predictable elements like Minuit's purchase of 1626 and Bronx Treaty of 1639. Not so predictable, however, were some of the floats commemorating other aspects of New York's indigenous history. The Iroquois contingent placed special emphasis on their floats, on representations of the traditional founding of the Iroquois League, and of their connectedness to and capacity for freedom of movement on their homelands. Assertions of nationhood that seem clear in retrospect, if perhaps not to contemporary audiences, and that stood in stark contrast to the carceral status they endured on the state's reservations. Once the parade ended, Iroquois performers remained in the area for another week, offering ceremonial dances at the dedications of various parks and historical monuments. Edward Hagaman Hall, chair of the Hudson Fulton Commemoration Commission, was at pains to assure the crowds that the performers were real Indians, not white people painted up for this occasion, and he defended his selection of exclusively Iroquois performers on the grounds that their ancestors were, after all, the controllers of the Indians who lived on these, i.e. Manhattan, Long, and Staten Islands. Sorry, Paul. I'm sure that's something that the Iroquois folks who were there didn't really argue with necessarily. But the pinnacle dramatic moment for the Iroquois at the Hudson Tricentennial in 1909 came on the 2nd of October at the Naval Fete on Columbia Lawn. And here we had a very dramatic scene enacted, and Mr. Hall, the chair of the commission, describes it in breathless detail, where their agent, the agent for the Iroquois people in the parade, this Mr. Moore fellow, appeared dressed in the style of Henry Hudson's time and impersonating the navigator, and walking toward the Indians, extended to them a friendly greeting. Sitting down in their midst, he solemnly accepted their pipe of peace and offered as gifts strings of bright-colored beads, which were received with manifestations of delight and which were passed from hand to hand. For a moment, those who could forget their very modern surroundings were transported back to the faraway past. Well, the official report of the commission offers us no hint of the degree of agency the Iroquois performers exercised in 1909 over the content of their appearances. I think we ought to allow for at least the very strong possibility that these performers in 1909 were attempting to make manifest that very faraway moment, one that articulated their memory of a relationship with the Dutch that would later serve as a diplomatic blueprint for their foreign relations with other European colonizers. Now, the scene might sound a bit patronizing at first. Indians delighted by the receipt of trinkets, and historically challenged to boot. No Iroquois are known to have met Hudson. But everything else about the Iroquois presence in the 1909 commemoration suggests a consciousness on their part of the legacy of Goswenta, a term denoting the character of Iroquois-Dutch relations. Indeed, I would argue that the representation of separate Iroquois nationhood in the parade, the selection of content in the floats, and the reenactment of the scene with Moore as Hudson reveal that consciousness, even if it was, so to speak, hiding in plain sight. I brought no dancers with me today, so I'm perhaps at a disadvantage in comparison to Mr. Moore, but what I hope to do in the next few minutes here is persuade you of the need for us to reverse the usual trajectory of colonial history in which settlers arrive and act, and native people react, and revisit the entangled state of cross-cultural relations that prevailed in New Netherland in Hudson's wake. And doing so, I think, facilitates an appreciation of history as lived for all parties concerned. And that appreciation, I've come to believe, is the first step toward an escape from the persistent colonial mindset that emphasizes the effects of colonization on native people to the exclusion of any consideration of the ways in which native polities shaped the experience of settler colonies in early North America. Goswenta, for the purposes of my presentation today, may be best understood as an Iroquois symbol for the ongoing negotiation of their relationship to European colonizers and their descendants, depicted in material form as a long beaded belt of white wampum with two parallel lines of purple wampum along its length. The lines symbolize the distinct identity of the two peoples and a mutual engagement to coexist in peace without interference in the affairs of the other. Goswenta signifies a separate but equal relationship between two entities based on mutual benefit and mutual respect for the other's freedom. And most significant among those freedoms is freedom of movement. The spatial metaphor bound up in Goswenta asserts that neither side may attempt to steer the metaphorical vessel of the other as it travels along its own self-determined path. Contemporary Haudenosaunee oral tradition associates the original elaboration of Goswenta-style relations between Iroquois nations and Europeans with a circa 1613 agreement negotiated between Mohawks and a Dutch trader named Jacob Elkins at Tawaganchi, near modern-day Normanskill Creek, prior to the establishment of Dutch Fort Nassau nearby. Iroquois scholars, and by this I mean people of Iroquois descent trained academically, and community authorities, have for the last 20 years consistently asserted the historical veracity of the two-row belt as a representation of these kinds of political arrangements in colonial-era treaty negotiations, and have increasingly in recent years pointed to the utility of the concept of Goswenta as a model for repairing indigenous settler relations in contemporary North America. Non-native scholars of the Iroquois, people like me, on the other hand, have been at considerable pains of late to dismiss the idea of Goswenta and or the two-row treaty as a legitimate historical phenomenon. A couple of examples. The standard reference book on Iroquois diplomacy, it's entitled The History and Culture of Iroquois Diplomacy, first published in 1985 and reprinted 10 years later, has no mention at all of the word Goswenta anywhere. In 1987, three prominent Iroquois scholars, authored an article that identified a parchment document purporting to represent the 1613 Tawaganchi Treaty as a 20th century forgery. For the record, I think that that interpretation in that paper is correct. That particular document is challenged in ways that it cannot be accepted at face value as an authentic representation of anything that happened in the 17th century. A couple of years ago, an article in a leading scholarly journal of Native American Studies went out and completely eliminated the possibility of the Two-Road Treaty as a real phenomenon, referring to it as a 19th century invention, a verbalization of an ancient assumption of autonomy, and even went so far as to warn people from using the concepts associated with it in courts, given its perplexing origins and ambiguous status. That surprised me when I read that article. In the process of researching the book that will hopefully come out early in the new year, I've identified 10 distinct documented recitations of the Goswenta tradition in documentary sources dating from 1656 to 1701. I'm not going to go through them. I'm actually writing another paper where there will be detailed ad nauseum for those interested. But what I want to suggest here is that there is substantial written evidence in support of the contemporary Iroquois oral tradition concerning Goswenta. And I think that not only are the current scholarly opinion dismissing it as illegitimate, I think not only needs to be revised, I would go so far to say is that our understanding of the character of early Dutch relations with Iroquois people is enriched by an integration of that oral tradition with the documentary evidence and archaeological data as well. Let me just give you one of the nuggets that illustrates what I'm talking about here. In June of 1689, a delegation of Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Oneida headmen came to Albany and were, as we've seen in some of the other papers today, talking about former relationships. Here they were advising Anglo-New York authorities about their former relationship with the Dutch, and the speech goes as follows, that in former times, the Mohawks, Oneidas, and Onondagas did carry the anchor of the ship that Jacques, and that's taken to be a reference to Elkins, came in, carried the anchor to Onondaga, that being the meeting place of the Five Nations. They said they were there in 1689 to renew the old covenant that had been made with Jacques many years ago, who came with a ship into their waters and received them as brethren. And then the Maquas, Mohawks, Oneidas, and Onondagas desired him to establish himself in this country, and the Senecas and Cayugas, they drew into that general covenant that they have with one accord, planted the tree of good understanding. So the point here of this particular story, at least as it was related in 1689, is that contact with the Dutch appears to have played a significant role in furthering along the process of the formation of the historically known Iroquois League. Okay? It's not the thing that starts it, but it's a step along the way. Okay? So what I want to do for the next few minutes here is go through and review with you a little bit of the evidence of early Iroquois relations with the Dutch, informed by an awareness of the historicity of the notion of Goswenta. And doing so, I think, helps us appreciate, on the one hand, how hard it was for Iroquois people to convey these ideas to the Dutch. But on the other hand, once these ideas came to be rooted in Iroquois-Dutch relations, how deeply integrated they were once the residents and visitors to New Netherland grasped their import. Okay, so we'll start with just a little, I'm just using pictures there to sort of provide a backdrop to what I'm talking about here. In September of 1609, Henry Hudson's voyage on behalf of the Netherlands took him as far as the Norman's Kill, south of modern-day Albany, and just 50 miles from the easternmost extant Mohawk village at that time. Although direct Mohawk contact with the Hudson or any Dutch national is not documented in written sources until 5 years later, archaeological evidence suggests extensive Mohawk involvement in Hudson River Valley trade as early as 1611, and the rapid movement thereafter of what one archaeologist has described as a tidal wave of Dutch trade goods as far west as contemporary Seneca territory. The founding moment of Dutch-Mohawk relations took place at some point prior to the establishment of Fort Nassau at Norman's Kill in 1614. Elkin's negotiations, often described as a treaty, might better be understood as a trading agreement that facilitated secure movement for both parties to and from a defined center of exchange. Relations patterned on the principles articulated in post-contact Goswenta ideology doubtless existed among indigenous nations prior to the intrusion of Europeans. What is interesting for our purposes are the ways in which the nations of the emerging Iroquois League endeavored to establish relations of mutual assistance and non-interference with the Dutch as an extension of similar processes they had undertaken with neighboring indigenous populations prior to 1609. Following the destruction of Fort Nassau in a 1618 flood, the Dutch presence on the Hudson assumed a more intermittent and unreliable character, and relations with the Iroquois suffered proportionally. In 1622, a Dutch trader who was mentioned in Paul's paper, Hans Joris Hantem, a longtime associate of Elkin's, took an unnamed Mohawk sachem, or leader, hostage and demanded a ransom. Perhaps the ransom was wampum. The record does not say. The Mohawks paid the ransom, but Hantem then went and cut out the male organs of the aforesaid chief and hung them on the mast stay with rope, and thus killed the sachem. This act, as overt a rejection of Goswenta principles as exists in the documentary record, cast a pall over Iroquois relations with the Dutch for nearly a decade. When the Dutch came back and established Fort Orange in 1624, the Iroquois immediately embarked on a campaign to displace their Mohican rivals and therefore gain direct access to Dutch traders. This was no petty squabble. Wider Iroquois objectives, such as obtaining a crucial alternative to French markets in the St. Lawrence River Valley, securing the power to broker other native nations access to the Dutch at Fort Orange, and testing the promises of mutual defense among their own constituent nations, all operated in what scholars have usually referred to in more parochial terms as the Mohawk-Mohican War. What was going on here? The Iroquois realized that if the Mohicans were able to set up shop near Fort Orange, they were positioned very well to link the wampum that we've just heard about being so critical that came in from the Atlantic coast with the rich northern pelts secured by their Algonquin and Montaigne allies in Canada, shutting out the Iroquois from the exchange axis they had so carefully worked to build over previous years. The Mohawks launched an offensive in 1624. The Mohicans beat it back and displaced the Mohawks, but the Mohawks don't go away. They actually move closer to Fort Orange in 1626. The Mohicans then decide to ask the Dutch for help, and in the one instance that we know of that the Dutch engaged in military activity against the Mohawks directly, it didn't go so well. The Dutch soldiers came out of the fort, ran into a Mohawk ambush less than 3 miles outside its boundaries, and the Mohawks killed 4 of the 6 Dutch soldiers, including their commander. Angered over this latest violation of what they thought they had in a Goswenta-style agreement, and perhaps recalling Hantem's murder 4 years earlier, the Mohawks, quote-unquote, devoured one of the Dutch soldiers and carried an arm and leg home from the other victims to be divided among their families as a sign that they had conquered their enemies. Several days later, in a conversation with a Dutch trader, unnamed Mohawks asked the reason why the Dutch had meddled in their conflict with the Mohicans. The learning curve continued. Dutch meddling, notwithstanding official West India Company recommendations to the contrary, continued until the Mohawks finally defeated and dispersed the Mohicans in 1628. The relationship appears to have stabilized thereafter, as the Dutch acclimated themselves to a primary economic relationship with the Mohawks at Fort Orange. Nevertheless, the Dutch were held to acceptable standards of behavior. Okay, the Mohawks valued their relationship, but the Dutch were not going to be able to get away with a great deal of tomfoolery. And when the Mohawk sachem Sego Driokta, then described as the head chief of the Mohawks, learned in 1633 that Hantem was back and had been appointed commissary at Fort Orange, 900 Iroquois warriors appeared before the fort and demanded his surrender. Hudson refused to leave. It's kind of amazing he actually lived through it. But what the assembled Iroquois army did was burn a West India Company sloop, slaughter all the livestock they could find on Killian Van Rensselaer's patroonship, and divert much of their traffic away from Fort Orange to rival French and English traders. And that's a depiction of Fort Orange there. I should have flipped up a minute ago. Okay? Sent in the dead of winter of 1634 to 35 to inquire about declining Iroquois business at Fort Orange, the Dutch barber surgeon Harman Meindert van den Bogart and two of his associates received a refresher on Goswenta from their Oneida hosts at the town of Oneutahaga on the 3rd of January 1635. While taking care to advertise their new contacts with French and English traders, the Oneidas assured Van den Bogart that if they received 4 hands of sewant, wampum, and 4 hands of long cloth for each large beaver pelt, a potentially significant increase in their buying power at Fort Orange, they would conduct their business with no one else. They cemented their offer with a present of 5 beaver belts to Van den Bogart and assured him that he, and by extension all other Dutch traders and emissaries, would enjoy free movement and generous hospitality at all the castles of the League Nations. An invitation. The Dutch emissaries hesitated, claiming to lack the authority to arrange the prices of trade goods, but promised to report the quest and return in the spring with an answer. Just published has been a cartoon version of the Van den Bogart narrative, where I can't say quite what I think of the drawings, but it is kind of interesting that they follow the text that has been translated recently by Charlie Geary. And it sort of shows the moment here where the deal is being offered and the invitation is being extended. Relations between the Mohawks and the Dutch can really be classified as quite chilly throughout the 1630s. Van den Bogart never went back with an answer to the Oneida's request. And in October of 1636, Patroon Killian Van Rensselaer continued to complain about Mohawk antagonism toward people at Fort Orange and petty incidents of violence against some of his settlers there. He failed to draw the connection between Mohawk attitudes, however, and his own dogged efforts to collect an indemnity payment from them for the property they had destroyed in 1633. Okay? So things didn't look so good in the 1630s, but 2 things about the Dutch colonial enterprise in New Netherland I think were critical toward allowing for the eventual repair and stabilization of relations over time. The first was the comparatively weak missionary impulse on the part of Calvinist ministers in New Netherland. Many of these men had families that they came over with and were not as free, you might say, as the Jesuits were to go off through the woods and follow native people on their seasonal rounds. The second, and I think perhaps most important reason why Dutch-Mohawk relations stabilized and flourished later in the century was the comparatively liberal attitude the Dutch had toward making firearms and ammunition available as trade goods. Other settler colonies attached serious restrictions to this trade. At the time, if you wanted to get a firearm and ammunition from the French, you were theoretically required to convert to Christianity first. That was a tough pill. The Dutch made no such prerequisite, and despite a few ceremonial and official proclamations against it, the firearms trade began to take off in the latter 1630s, and by 1641, the Mohawks could field, as it was said, 400 armed men. Guns like shell wampum and brass kettles before them soon spread rapidly throughout Iroquois, making them the best armed native population in the Northeast more quickly than anyone else. Okay? So it was this trade in firearms, I think, that provided a basis for Dutch efforts to mend fences. In the hyper-competitive economic atmosphere in New Netherland that followed the West India Company's termination of its monopoly on the fur trade in 1639, Dutch officials realized that the Mohawks, who could now drive increasingly hard bargains, required some diplomatic attention, and Van Rensselaer abandoned, after 6 years, his effort to collect the indemnity from the Mohawks and sent his camise, or chief representative, Ernst von Kurler, to Mohawk country in July of 1640 with 3 very fine blankets for Mohawk leaders, a gift that was to signify the great friendship prevailing between the two nations. A little bit of movement here on the part of the Dutch, okay, who, after all, had a priority in their colonial enterprise that we know of. 3 years later, in 1643, Van Curler returned to Mohawk country on an official errand to attempt the ransom of the French Jesuit Isaac Jogues and 2 of his associates, then in Mohawk custody. Van Curler's opening speech offered an explicit nod toward a Kaswenta relationship, in which Van Curler said we should keep on good terms as neighbors and that they should do no injury to either the colonists or their cattle. It was the cows they went after constantly. Leaders from all 3 Mohawk towns thankfully accepted Van Curler's renewal of the Kaswenta relationship, but they turned down his offer of about 600 guilders in goods for the ransom of Jogues, preferring to manage his repatriation on their own terms. In reality, what they wanted to do was use Jogues as a prop to convey an image of their own military might and thereby secure tribute payments from Munsee populations in the lower Hudson River Valley. Jogues escaped on one of those expeditions to Fort Orange, and with the assistance of Dutch officials there, eventually was spirited out through Manhattan and ended up back in France. The Mohawks threatened to destroy Rensselaerswyck entirely in the aftermath of the shenanigans with Jogues' escape. But as the French sources indicate, presents to the value of 300 French livres eventually persuaded them to return home peacefully. My sources on 17th century currency exchange suggest to me that they came off a little much better than they would have if they'd taken the first offer by doing this. In other words, the Dutch were desperate to get rid of them. John Smith, and most colorfully, the Flemish bastard, whom French Jesuits described in horrified terms as an execrable issue of sin, the monstrous offspring of a Dutch heretic father and a pagan Reed Mohawk mother. Though recent archaeological study has argued that the Dutch had only limited sexual interest in Mohawk women and vice versa, the documentary record reveals abundant evidence to the contrary. Matrilineal descent reckoning among the Iroquois meant that individuals like Anaquese could be raised as Mohawks by their mothers without the stigma of illegitimacy, and such practices were normative among indigenous peoples in establishing mutual ties between different communities and nations, making of one people, as it were, out of allied groups. Okay? Now that picture did not happen in the 17th century. That picture happened on the 5th of April, 2009 in Amsterdam, where a Mohawk representative, rather unfortunately dressed in plains garb it would appear, is presenting a 2-row belt to the Deputy Mayor, Carleen Gerels of the city of Amsterdam. Okay, in my last couple minutes here, I know I'm running out of time, but I want to just suggest to you that one of the things that is a recurrent theme of Iroquois-Dutch contacts in the latter years of the official Dutch presence is this constant reminding by Mohawk and other people to the Dutch of their obligations. Okay, and we see the Dutch over time increasingly becoming a little more solicitous, a little more aware of this, and responding. Okay, probably the most significant response happens in 1659 when the Mohawks come in and want to lay out a series of grievances. The Dutch make what appears to have been only about the 3rd official embassy into Mohawk country and offer generous presents and try to patch everything up. Okay. Now that we've reached the end of our expedited tour of Iroquois-Dutch relations, what I hope we can more fully appreciate is the degree to which the principles of Kaswenta operated and came to operate in the daily lives of settlers and native peoples alike in New Netherland. By extending their principles of intergroup relations from the pre-contact era to new Dutch arrivals after 1613, the Iroquois sought to incorporate these potentially valuable neighbors as allies while maintaining their own political and indeed physical freedom of movement. The Dutch, after a learning curve of some duration, appear to have recognized the degree to which their interests would also be served by a relationship of peers sailing the metaphorical river of life in separate vessels. Kaswenta relations were not static. They evolved over time as ties between the Iroquois and Dutch deepened and socio-political circumstances grew more complex. But they were real. An Iroquois oral tradition regarding Kaswenta, I think, helps us grasp this. why is it, I think what I want to, just sort of suggest here and ask is why is it so difficult for us to accept the possibility that the oral tradition here has a place for us, something to think about. One of the oldest tricks in the colonizer's playbook has been to deny the authenticity and or the antiquity of indigenous traditions. Eurocentric scholarship, when it adopts these approaches, works to conflate contemporaneous cultural and political difference between indigenous and settler nations into a temporal sequence. Shorn of a true or authentic past, the indigenous nation is placed in an inferior position, behind in terms of its cultural development, and thus susceptible to the demands of the colonizing mission. Mohawk legal scholar Joyce de King adds a further salient point regarding the difficulties Iroquois nations face in contending with voting democracies in the United States and Canada. As she says, each new regime leaves behind the policies of its predecessor, forgetting the agreements and lessons of the past, and placing the burden of education regarding those agreements on Iroquois people. It's worth noting in conclusion that the very concept of Goswenta facilitates a fuller recognition of the reality of historical co-evilness, the simultaneous coexistence of others with their own historical trajectories and with their own stories to tell. Analyzing the historicity of Goswenta raises our awareness of an Iroquois understanding of cross-cultural relationship that works towards unity, not uniformity, but unity, by demonstrating how differences between individuals, communities, and nations have to be acknowledged and integrated rather than annihilated or absorbed. Iroquois people extended this invitation to the Dutch upon their first arrival in what is now New York. They did so in highly constrained circumstances 100 years ago in Manhattan, and they continue to do so today. Thank you very much.